Good morning, Sandra. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, great, great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. And we've talked briefly before. It's the first time we've had a proper conversation. Um, but this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the two biggest and most important philosophical questions: what's real and how should we understand reality? But also what and who matters, questions of ethics and how far should our compassion extend. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which suggests that when it comes to thinking about what's real, we should take a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason. And when it comes to our ethical scope and who gets to matter, that should be all sentient beings, any being that has the capacity to suffer, to flourish, to have experiences. But I'm talking in these conversations to people who agree and disagree with either or both of those aspects of sentientism. So it'll be fascinating to understand your personal philosophical journey and how you put that into practice. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work?
Well, yes, I'm Sandra Namoto. I'm 40 years old, identify as a Filipino-Canadian, introvert, wife, aunt, woman of color. And then professionally, I feel like I came out of the womb as a writer. I think that's the one gift of literacy my mom really gave me at a young age. And I really took that into my career. So from AP English in high school to a degree in English literature and film studies. Did not pick up a camera, so not those kinds of film studies.
Yeah.
Writing essays. And then right after school, I landed my first internship at a public relations firm. Knew nothing about public relations, but that ended up being my career for over 10 years. Because after I left that first company, I was inspired to start my own business. So I ran an agency for over 10 years. After closing that, did not think I wanted to stay in marketing, wanted a good 10-foot pole between me and the practice.
Yeah.
But after doing some career exploration, I was thinking about becoming a hypnotherapist, a genealogist at one point. I sat down to meditate, and meditation is a big part of my spiritual practice now. And just this booming voice kind of came to me at the end of 2019 and said, "You're vegan now, and you'll always be writing. So put those two things together." And so at the start of 2020, I started a new business as a solo content writer and editor, as the content doctor. And that's the business that I run today. And I've written 2 books. The second has recently come out, called Vegan Marketing Success Stories, and serving businesses as well as authors who are self-publishing. So those are two of my audiences. And so, yes, in addition to the content writing and editing for businesses, I also have a number of services that I offer to authors like me who self-publish books.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. And I think the themes of sort of marketing and messaging and high quality writing will come back into our final question when we think about how we can sort of nudge humanity into more positive directions too. So it'd be great to come back to that. Thank you. So let's
Sure.
start with the first of these crazily big philosophical questions. And you've hinted at how you might answer this question already. But many of my guests tell this story by starting out explaining how they grew up, whether that was in maybe a more supernatural, religious, mystical sort of context, or one that was more naturalistic or scientifically minded or atheist or agnostic originally, and how that side of their thinking shifted over time, if it has. So yeah, you can wind the clock back as far as you like, and be fascinating to know your story on epistemology, I guess.
Yes. So I grew up in a very Catholic household. I would say around the same time, my mom taught my siblings and I to read and write. This is pre-kindergarten. She also taught us the prayers. So Catholicism is, I believe, the biggest religion practiced in the Philippines, and is probably one of the countries, at least in Asia, where that religion is particularly dominant, and that is due to the colonization of Spain.
Yeah.
Centuries ago. So, so that was my upbringing. And then I went through 13 years of Catholic school. So kindergarten right through to grade 12. And so religion, that particular religion has been a big part of my early life. And then leaving school was an interesting time because I still considered myself, a pretty devout Catholic. Even when I left Vancouver to go on exchange, to Toronto for a year, there was a Catholic church 10 minutes from where I was staying, and so I would go every Sunday. And then it wasn't until I came back to Vancouver where I went to the same parish that, like I said, I've been to growing up as a child. One of the, I think the first sermon that I went to when I came back was about fundraising. And this is actually common at the time. The church was, it needed renovations. It needed it needed to be rebuilt.
Yeah.
And so that wasn't unusual because, the priest would often, forgo the typical sermon to talk about how important the fundraising is. So that, I consider those kind of a waste of my hour because I don't learn anything, new about the scripture. And I think either the next time or the next few times I came back, there was a sermon specifically about how we don't really welcome gay people into our in our practice. And that was something new that I hadn't experienced before. And I think it was just a product of the times, like, them trying to keep up, and we need to start talking about this.
And how explicit was that? Was it this sort of coded, subtle language hints and so
subtle,
on? Or was it really straight down the line?
Very subtle, very vague, a lot of circular talk, like not even really outright talking about who we're talking about. But we're all smart enough.
Yeah, the messages are coming
adult
through.
Audience, to know what they're talking about. And at the time, two of my best friends had just come out as gay, and so that was very close to me. And it had never occurred to me that the church, even though I knew this as an adult, their beliefs are not, at least most sects of Christianity are not welcoming to queer identifying people. So that just turned me off. Like that was the last, sermon or intentional church service that I have, that I had gone to. I've of course gone to weddings and stuff like that, but that just sort of changed my whole spiritual direction, I would say. And
that's quite a common story. So some of my guests are still religious now, but most of them have left an established religion, then gone some different path. Mine is a sort of boring naturalistic atheist, but others have found different routes as well. But the thing you mentioned there, that sort of ethical challenge, has been quite a common theme where people will go along with the beliefs and they'll say, okay, there is a God and there's a heaven and a hell and there's this and that. And you sort of just assume that stuff is correct.
I never did believe in the heaven and hell. I will have to say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I always knew that I didn't believe everything the Bible said, like things like heaven and hell. I never took literally. I always thought, these are metaphors for where we might end up when we die. And the whole point of, following this religion is to be a good person. And that's the one thing that has always stuck with me is that that's what we're all here for. And I do believe in an afterlife. But in terms of those very linear, straightforward beliefs, that was never really my style to begin with.
And I'm interested in where you went next, because for some people, they hit something like that, homophobic ethical thing, or it might be a racist thing or a sexist thing or a transphobic thing or anti-Semitism or bigotry against apostates or people who have other worldviews. There's unfortunately quite a portfolio you can select from. That don't run through all religions, but there seemed to be something problematic in almost every established religion. So when they hit that, some people will use that as the trigger to reject the entire enterprise and just say, look, I'm out, right? This just doesn't make sense to me because the ethics are broken. So I think the whole thing is broken. And they might go from, established religion to just not believing in the supernatural world at all. Other people will say, what's happened here? There is something in Catholicism and Christianity or Islam or something else, or whichever the religion they come up in, which is at its core really about a universal compassion and caring and, and the golden rule and all that stuff, right? And that's the real core. All these problematic things are just stuff that powerful men have sort of unfortunately added in over the centuries to break it. So they will then still say, I'm still a Catholic, I'm still a Christian, or I'm still a Muslim, but they will explicitly carve out, cherry pick, and reject the problematic ethics. And you can see that in a very positive context, because in a way, that's the pressure that makes some of these religious institutions haltingly and painfully modernize a little bit over time, as they're sort of drawn towards a more secular, more compassionate ethic. So people will stick with it, but then just say, but not that bit, not that bit. I don't believe in the hell piece, because how could torturing people for eternity be compassionate? Yep. and I'm certainly rejecting the homophobia, and I'm rejecting the traditional female roles, and I'm rejecting whatever it is. Did you reject the whole of Catholicism at that point? And then where did you go on to next?
Pretty much, yeah. I would say
You're just like, I'm done with this.
Yeah, of course. I still have loved ones who are devout, and they go, and I'm sure it's influenced them in a positive way. In fact, they say so, and they've asked me, if you don't jive with this particular priest or parish, why don't you find another one? Is what they say, right? And it's because I've learned that there's a huge problem with the whole institution. And if you're not fixing what's wrong at the top, it just all trickles down. And I couldn't articulate that probably until a few years ago. But I would say for a good decade, I was probably just living my life, great. I don't have to go to church on Sundays. It wasn't until I started meeting intuitives. So this is around the time I started my business. And as a part of networking, I came upon people who were spiritually minded, but not religious, or like me, had come from a Catholic background and left it. And this idea of intuitives and people being able to read you and know things about you that they couldn't possibly. So that's what just started opening my mind to these other ideas. And I would say that's intuition has become quite a big part of my life now, as well as the idea of connecting to my past ancestors. Again, not in a religious sense, but I do feel that I have this strong sense of connection with them. And there are some events that have happened in my life that where I feel like they're giving me signs. They're giving me signs that even though they've crossed the other side, like they're still here and watching over us and are around in some way. So that's how my line of thinking has sort of developed over the years.
You. That's fascinating. And I'd like to dig into those two things. But one thing before we move away from the Catholicism idea, you mentioned the fact that in the Philippines, the prevalence of Catholicism is really due to colonialism, ultimately. And you can see that in lots of different places around the world. The dominant religion is there because it was frankly imposed by colonizers. And I sometimes wonder, given the rightful pushback and challenge on colonial ideas, how the colonial religions seem to be sort of escaping the pushback to some degree, in that quite often the very populations that have rejected and walked away from and are challenging the history of colonialism and the damage it's done, still by and large, or very strongly, seem to hold on to the religion that was imposed on them by the colonizers. I don't know if that's just an observation, but I'd be interested in whether you have a perspective on that from a sort of context of the Philippines and friends and family and how people think about it.
I have to say, I mean, I haven't been to the Philippines since I was 2. It's something I'd love to do in the next few years. And I don't feel very connected to the country. I don't know. I don't consume enough media to know what's going on over there. And so I'm sure there is some sort of a pushback. I just don't know enough about it. What I do know is that the Filipinas Filipinx across the diaspora. So those of us who have immigrated or grown up in places like North America or Europe, we've started to, at the very least, have an interest in pre-colonial history and started to try and perpetuate those cultures. So, for example, tattooing was a very common practice before the Spanish came. Everybody was tattooed, men, women. It was just part of the culture. And now that we know this, and that information has started to proliferate thanks to the internet, it's not taboo anymore. It's not a stigma. It doesn't mean you're an evil person to get a tattoo or to get your body covered. It's actually a part of our reclamation process and decolonizing process. And so it's exciting to see people like me and the younger folks interested in the history and the culture and actively bringing that back into their lives. So I see that happening certainly in the diaspora. I don't know how much of it is. I mean, I do know there are tattoo artists in the Philippines, so it is a thing to some extent, but yeah, as much as it is pushing back against, I guess, the dominant religion or cultural forces that, have been around for hundreds of years, I'm not too aware of that.
Yeah, thank you. And it's been interesting because there's been at least a couple of my guests who, for them, their journey away from religion did link up with this challenging of colonialization as well. And they followed a similar journey to you, in that they went from an established religion to something that was not religious but spiritual, and they felt in a sense that was more aligned with the pre-colonial ways of thinking and belief systems that were around in the places where their diaspora came from than the colonial imposition of Catholicism or whatever the variety might have been. So it's an interesting dynamic. So let's come back to the you talked about this idea of intuitives and ancestors and belief in an afterlife. And as I've said, I'm not sort of quite boring straight down the line, sort of scientific, naturalistic, atheistic. I'm skeptical of many of these things. But at the same time, I think there's some areas of potential overlap as well. And I think of intuition as a really important way of thinking where, there's things going on in our brain we're not necessarily consciously aware of, but we may have picked up. So there could be certain types of cognition that's going on that we're not consciously aware of, or we might perceive things that we didn't explicitly think of. And I think of those types of things as being a valuable part of our intuitive thinking. And in the same way, I might think about the value of my own ancestors, but I think of it in a very sort of naturalistic way, and that there are memories and there are echoes and there's obviously the biological inheritance that I take from them and so on. But I get the sense from you that it's beyond that. It is something that is more supernatural. There is something much more real about those things. And that, I would assume, links to your belief in an afterlife as well. So can you describe to me whether those things are sort of stitched together, and what do you think they actually are, to the extent it's possible to describe them?
Yeah, I think there's different levels to intuition and how it serves us. So I think there's that, I mean, at a basic level, there's that gut feeling. And that's something for a few years I had downplayed, because in 2013, I joined a self-development program, which 4 years later was determined to be quite a dangerous cult, and the leader of which is now serving prison time. So NXIVM is that organization. And I never went, So, and I never went to the point where I got deep into the organization and really was, mentally affected by the more nefarious things that were going on. My studies were very much at a service level. And I did gain some great things from what I learned in that program. But one of the modules that they presented was about data, and the fact that I'm going to paraphrase here, but the data that you can see, experience, touch, like that is what you should base your belief on. Intuition was very much downplayed, and it communicated as something that could actually lead you astray from the person that you want to be. A lot of their teachings was sort of like, if it hurts, if it feels painful, move toward it, because that's how you get over it and you become, a better person, etc.
It's interesting because for many sort of cult or cultish groups, they tend to be much more pro intuition and much more against sort of data and evidence and so on. So it's quite interesting that they sort of spin that the other way around and then still come up with the conclusion you should, run into pain, which is
that was an interesting time, because I feel like I was really exploring my own belief system, and I took what I could from the program, right? But for those for that brief time, I was like, oh, okay, well, let's ignore intuition. Let's try doing that at least. and I found, even before taking that program, like intuition has been, just a huge part of how I make decisions. That's what I want to say. Because whenever I've ignored it, my brain comes up with this idea, why don't you try this? And I was like, no, like a few years later, the idea comes back to me even stronger. And I get even more signs in terms of the direction that, like, how to actually execute. So I feel like, on one sense, it could just be a gut feeling. It could just be my brain, ready for the idea at the right time when I am. And then I guess to link it to more of my spiritual beliefs, I guess it's when I meditate, I get, and of course this is not every time, but I think when I'm in a deep enough state where my thoughts are not dominating, that's sort of when I get these other unexpected ideas that I just just wouldn't have consciously thought, though that starts to trickle in. And I experienced that same thing the night my grandfather died, my paternal grandfather. He was quite a big presence in my family. And that evening I sat down to meditate, and he just gave me such a clear image. And he was a kind of guy that he did not, he spoke very straightforwardly. He did not like speaking in metaphors. And it was very telling of his personality. So he was just like, here's where I am now, and don't worry. I got that clear image, and that just kind of gave me that sense of, okay, like he's in this other place and he's doing great. And watching over us. That's another thing. He was a pilot. He was an airline pilot when he lived. And so him in a plane was that image that I got, and watching over us. He was an aerial photographer
from the plane.
So you can't get any clearer than that. And then the other sort of ancestral experience was actually more physical. So 3 years ago, I visited Montreal for a cousin's wedding, and back in 2006, I had an older cousin who had passed away, and so she lived in Montreal, and so my husband and I were walking down, one of these main streets, and I saw these lights down on Rue Saint Denis Street, and I went, let's go over and check things out over here. And I didn't remember from the last time I was in Montreal that this is quite a popular street. So we were just checking things out, and then I came upon the exact restaurant that my cousin had taken me to the last time I had visited with her when she was living in Montreal. And I had my husband take a picture of me there, and I went, this was not a coincidence. This was her just welcoming me back into the city. So that's
guided you there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that wasn't even, I wouldn't even call that intuition. It was more like, we're exploring the city. Let's check this out. But the sign was just, I could have walked right by that restaurant and not even known that was it. But because it was, just the colors were very clear. I just feel like she had meant for me to be there and recognize that memory, and that she's still, like, she seems, she has a very big spiritual presence in my life, because she was quite young when she passed away.
Thank you. And how do you think of these things in relation to, I guess, the more natural world, if you like. So I guess we've got, the stuff we're used to that when you break it down is molecules and atoms and quarks and maybe some weird quantum field stuff. So there's the things that are described by physics and, material objects and the interactions between them and energy and all that sort of stuff. How do you think of these phenomena? Do you think of them as just a completely different type of stuff in some different realm? And how do they interact? Or is it not something you can
I appreciate that you brought in the science, because from the little that I know of quantum physics, this is all very possible. Because if we think, of that atom and the fact that most of the things around each atom is just energy, then if you think about that, then nothing ever really dies, right? I mean, the body dies, but the spirit, the energy is going somewhere. Or maybe nowhere, it's just sticking around. That's why we have ghosts.
That's interesting.
So that works. That's how it works into my belief. I try and take that science and work it in with my beliefs.
That's interesting. So you don't see it as a completely separate realm. You see these things as part of our natural world, and ultimately, if we understood the physics well enough, we might be able to see and understand and explore this stuff and examine it in different ways. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and I even think about, there are brilliant quantum physicists out there studying like things like the Big Bang or like the earliest atoms, and that's my definition of God.
Yeah.
Like how I think of God is the creator. So the thing that existed before everything existed. And it exploded, and because there was this potential of what I believe is love. It exploded, and we all come from this I like to call it stardust just because it sounds cool.
Yeah.
Stardust from that original Big Bang. And so we're all part of this creative force. And then to bring it back to intuition, I think everybody, at least humans have this sense of intuition that we came, from this original energy source. And if we can tap more into that source, the more it benefits us. That's how I sort of believe. But I think there are other people who have sort of this extra level sense, like where they can sense, beings that have passed. Others might have more of a connection to nature. They intuit nature, others animals. I think we're all sort of gifted in, maybe just at a gut level. But others are more Olympian, level intuitives.
Particular talent tapping into that stuff. So, and you talked about the phenomena of ancestors, the afterlife, intuitives, but your concept of God was more of a sort of origin of the universe and the sort of broadly defined physics and stuff that originated it.
That's what it is now. Yeah.
Does your worldview still include that God having, a personality, if you like, or being an active presence in the world in the same way as a Catholic might think of a God? Or is your sense of a God a much more sort of amorphous, well, in a way, the universe is God, and the personalities and the agents in your worldview are both living humans and your ancestors? And so, okay, I guess that is too long a question. The short question is, do you think of God as being a personality, a sort of beyond natural personality that persists in the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I also like to refer to it as universe as well.
Yeah.
So I guess I believe both, because if God was the only thing that existed in the beginning, I don't think they had a personality. We don't even have the language around this, right?
Yeah.
But as the universe has evolved and continues to evolve, I think God has just made its way into everything. That's how I would explain it.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Thank you. So one of the things that I find really interesting in this journey from sort of traditional religion to more spiritual but not religious, if you want to use that term very broadly, is it, as we come on to ask this next question about ethics, it strikes me that we do mitigate some of the ethical risks of traditional religions, because with a traditional religion, you normally have, some form of book with rules that were written a long time ago by powerful men, which don't fit the modern day at all. We've talked about some of those problems. Yeah. You also have this sense that ultimately what matters isn't just compassion and love, it's actually obedience to the deity. So the reason why we're compassionate is because God commands us to be compassionate and to love each other. But ultimately, if God tells us to do something wrong, we should still do that, because it's actually about obedience and submission and doing what you're told. So there's those senses sometimes that come through in traditional religions. And one of the classic stories is that of Abraham being commanded to kill his child by God.
Mm-hmm.
And the message from that was, if God tells you to do something that is deeply uncompassionate, you do it, right? Because God's the boss, and ultimately worshipping God and following God is what matters, even more than compassion to our fellow sentient beings. So it feels to me like when you move away from a religion that has that sort of clear personal deity with a list of rules, and you go to something that's more amorphously spiritual but not religious, you lose some of that ethical risk, because you open up space for just a more universal compassion, this sense of love flowing through things, a sense of interconnectedness. So I think the risk level drops, if you like, and I think you sort of talked to some of that. But at the same time, there are people who are in that spiritual but not religious space who have gone from that sort of warm, compassionate, we are all one, we're all connected, into some much darker ethical places where they will tell a story that sounds very much like yours, but instead of taking that into a place of compassion and connection, will take that into a place where they end up, selling scam supplements or crystals, or taking advantage of gullible people, or, hence your experience with NXIVM, taking people into sort of coercive cult-like situations and so on. So I don't expect you to be able to answer this question, but do you have a sense of how we can put safeguards, make sure people don't fall down that path? If they're committed to a sort of spiritual way of thinking, how can we make sure those ethical guardrails are still there, that they don't end up in the next version of NXIVM? Or
I think we're still figuring that out, because as the internet has opened up this opportunity to share ideas, there are obviously people out there who maybe even unintentionally are doing things, as you said, selling things that don't actually work, or not scientifically proven. But there's nobody around telling you, hey, like, this is actually a scam, or this, the leader of this is actually doing criminal activity. And so it's on each of us to really put on, and this is something that I've really been thinking about in the last few years, critical thinking caps, especially with the era of COVID. And really having to, for ourselves, seek out information, credibility of that information, and discern for ourselves what is real. And then having to act on that. And so, I can, I'm 5 years out of NXIVM now. And so I have the ability to look back and say, yep, that's how I fell into it. And now I know some of the red flags, so that I don't, join a similar organization. But I think we're still figuring that out, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. Let me give you another podcast recommendation, which is called Conspirituality.
Oh, yes, I've heard of it.
Have you heard of it? Yeah, and they're great because, and the reason those guys, I think, do the job so well is because they grew up in these worlds, right? They were invested in the yoga world, the spiritual world, the wellness world, and I think they have a rich appreciation for the value that many people get from all of these different ways of thinking, spiritual and otherwise. But at the same time, they've got a level of expertise around spotting those red flags and those problems. And I think that's a really impressive resource for people who are drawn to these ways of thinking, to just keep their eyes and ears open and put their critical thinking cap on and realize when something's going a little bit dark. So it's fascinating. But I find that a great resource. So
great. Yeah, I'm going to start listening to it now.
Yeah, give it a go. Cool. Well, that's been brilliant. Thank you. And we've already started to sort of queue up the next big question, which is what matters. So for people who've grown up in a strictly or in a more established religious worldview, the idea of ethics is sort of obvious because it normally comes as part of the package. The Bible has the 10 Commandments and, do what God says and so on. So that's fine. Whether people have followed a sort of naturalistic path like me, or a sort of atheistic path, or a more spiritual path, the question opens up, okay, so what is your ethics based on now? What do good and bad and right and wrong even mean? And you've hinted at some of that already because you talked about love and a sense of connection and so on. But how would you describe, I guess, the foundation of your ethics are now in your worldview?
Yeah, I think it's as simple as be a good person as much as you can
Yeah,
in this
yeah,
in the world that we live in, where we're challenged on a daily basis to just be consumers. I think that's our big challenge today. Is yeah, I think it's important to care for everyone as much as you can, and then of course, I'm vegan. That now extends to animals, and it didn't before. Like I honestly did not care very much for animals. And I don't own any, I don't own it, or not that we all, not that any of us own any animals, but I don't have any animals living in my home. I just, yeah, I don't have that kind of like innate connection to them, but I do know, yeah, from all the documentaries that I've seen, that we're not treating them very well during, the lives that they live, until we make them food. And so that has definitely extended to our treatment of animals, and then also the natural world. I mean, we're depleting our earth, more than she can withstand. So I think that, yeah, that extends to our treatment of our home as well.
yeah. Thank you. And that's the second part of this question is, we talk about what matters and what do right and wrong and good and bad even mean, and being good and caring for others, I think, is something that almost everybody would agree with. But the critical question then is, okay, well, who do we care for, and how far does our compassion go? And you've talked already about that journey of extending that beyond humans into thinking about non-human animals, and even beyond that too. And it sounds like your journey is quite interesting, because most of the conversations I've had with people, there's a variety of different routes, but most of them have had something to do with companion animals or experience with animals personally, or an affinity with non-human animals that was, part of the early trigger. But it doesn't sound like that was your story so much. So it would be interesting to understand how you came on to this question of extending your compassion beyond humans to non-humans, and what were the steps, and how difficult was that for you?
I'm big on documentaries, as I mentioned right at the top. Degree in film
The film
studies, and
studies,
that and
yeah.
that just means I enjoy, watching movies and then thinking about them.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm big on documentaries, and so watching
Oh,
Earthlings at
yeah.
the end of 2007 just hit me real hard.
Yeah.
But even more so, the Q&A at the end, where somebody asked, there was a person from the Vancouver Humane Society who was there to answer questions, and somebody in the audience said, "What is one thing we can all do to help these animals?" And she said, "Stop eating meat."
That
Like, it was
simple.
just as simple as that. And I knew she was right. I did not know how I would go about becoming vegan, but I feel like, yeah, as soon as the idea of becoming vegan hit my brain, and just combined with, I guess, my belief system at that point in my life, I was just like, this is it. This is how I start living that ethical lifestyle and becoming the good person that I want to be. So that was really the catalyst. And
Yeah.
of course,
So
I've
it's
since seen.
quite
uh,
a key moment there that just flicked a switch in your mind, and you're on that track. Yeah.
Yeah, having seen footage of something that I had never seen before, and it's so simple. It's
Yeah.
how our food is made. But if you can emotionally relate to that, then I think that can be quite powerful. And it was for me, and several documentaries since have also contributed to that. Yeah, to my path. I mean, it took me 11 years. It did not take me, a short amount of time, but
Yeah.
because of the information that I kept adding to my arsenal and remembering why it's important to be vegan, that yeah, that sort of has helped me.
Yeah. And it's interesting you went back to it, and you kept exploring and pushing it, because I guess the classic response to even seeing a film like that is to put it out of your head completely, desperately try not to think about the topic ever again, pretend that maybe it was just, a couple of bad apple farms, and, instead I'll believe the humane washing myth of happy cows and pigs and so on. So there's so many, human
and
psychological
and it was
tricks we can
actually.
use to desperately try and avoid something that is so obvious. But it sounds like you stayed on that path, at least.
Mhm. Yeah, I also just wanted to drop in and say, I think within 10 minutes of the documentary, there were some. It was a screening at the University of British Columbia, so there were some big like, I don't know if they were basketball or football players, but they were wearing the university jackets and walked right out of the theater 10 minutes in. Like they were not, they were like,
Yeah.
we're out. and I was like, well, if they're not, if they don't have the guts to sit, for the next hour and see this, I'm going to sit my ass down and witness it for myself. And that really hit me.
Yeah. And you talked about it then being a long journey, and mine was even longer than that. I went vegetarian in my mid-20s and vegan, probably another 20 years after that. So it's been a long, painful journey, which hopefully helps me be compassionate when I'm talking to other people who haven't gone on that journey yet, because I can remember who I was then. I wasn't a bad person really, but just using that psychological toolkit to avoid the obvious. But did you find that a difficult journey? And I mean that, I guess, both, psychologically thinking these things through, emotionally, practically, but also socially as well. Did you feel social pressure not to head down that path towards giving up animal products?
Not really. I mean, most of my loved ones are not even plant forward, I would say.
Yeah.
And so there have been many times where, we've gotten together as a family, and I just bring what I can eat. That's my contribution. And they've not, they've never asked me, or expressed curiosity for the lifestyle, and I want to respect that. That's the journey they're on. But I've never experienced any sort of pressure to go back. Although I can remember just at a summer picnic recently, the entire table was filled with meat, and I think one of my husband's friends was like, "Come over to the dark side." And I'm like, "No, it's you. Come over to this side."
Don't you know what that stuff is?
And then practically, I would say, I just had to learn how to cook better. That was really the challenge that I got over, because when I decided to, or I was at the point where I was ready to cut meat out. I was still eating some seafood, but I just started buying like veggie pizzas and fish sticks and sticking them in the oven. And my husband, or who was my boyfriend at the time, had some experience at restaurants and went, this is not healthy. You should not be eating all this processed food. So I really had to learn how to, just cook with veggies more.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. So you talked a little bit about the environment and concern for the planet as a whole as well, because that's one criticism sometimes of the stance I'm putting forward, which is this sentiocentric stance. So there's anthropocentrism, where we just really care about humans. There's sentiocentrism, where we care about all of the sentient beings in the wild, in our farms, in our homes, including humans, any being that can suffer too. But some people challenge that and say, look, you're not going far enough. We need to think about non-sentient living things like plants. We need to think about the ecosystems and so on too. And I do care about all of those things richly and deeply, because they're so important for the experiences of all the sentient beings. But I don't care about a rock or a river or even a tree in its own right. I care about it because of the impact on the sentient beings. How do you think about that sort of concern for the wider environment? Do you see it in a similar sort of way to me, that it's because of the sentient beings, or do you think those things warrant moral consideration in their own right?
I think we have a similar level of thinking. I did not consider even having the ability to communicate with nature until I read a book a few years ago called Behaving as If the God in All Life Mattered by Michelle S. Wright. Was recommended by a shaman who I met. It was part of a reading circle. And in that book, the author talks about how she, without like zero gardening skills, listened to the vegetables that were telling her how they would like to be grown. And she created an entire garden, and this is a real garden. It's called Paralandra Center for Nature Research. I'm sure it's, she's got a team of people handling it now, but in the book she talks about how, she intuited from these vegetables, sort of this circular pattern, not the rows that we now think of modern vegetable farming. It was in this very specific pattern. And she even has a story in that book about communicating with an inanimate object, which to me was like, whoa, okay, now we're talking about like objects, right? But
I mean, I love my coffee mug, but
you're not going to be talking to it. Yeah.
Well,
you're like, this coffee was cold.
Not often. Yeah.
But yeah, just so that book just really kind of opened me up to like, oh, like what if that, if that's possible, and I'm not saying it is, then we have a huge responsibility to this home that we have. And I've since read, I was just going to say, there have been studies where, if you play a certain type of music while you're growing a plant, it actually grows more than it would have, and sort of these scientific studies with plants, and that sort of added to this idea that yes, they do actually sense this energy from us, or that we're giving off to them, and that can affect how they grow. So
fascinating. And do you get the impression that she believes that, for example, a carrot growing in the ground is conscious, and does that therefore mean it can suffer? And does that mean we're doing a moral wrong by cutting into vegetables or fruits or plants?
I don't think she says that outright, but from what, the having read the book, I think that's what she's intuiting. But I don't think the carrot would say, you are harming me or you're killing me by eating me, because I think that's its purpose. Its purpose is to feed us, to give us that energy. So I think there's a cyclical
that's interesting.
Kind of element to it.
And the worry in my mind is that some people say that about farmed animals too. And I'm just worried that us humans are quite good at convincing ourselves of, stories that justify the things we want to do. And I'm not worried about the carrot at all, because I'm highly confident it's not sentient. It just doesn't have the capacity to do the things that your and my brain can do. But that's an interesting angle and an interesting perspective, that she was intuiting and connecting with, the fruit and vegetables that were explaining to her how best to grow them so that she could consume them. So fascinating. Yeah. So let's move on from those crazily big philosophical questions, because I think you've told us a great, fascinating story about, your journey thinking about what's real and then who matters in our ethics too. And the themes there are clear and come through quite powerfully, in this sense of compassion and caring in a very generous way, I think seems like it's at the center of it for you. And the final question is, how can we make a better future? So for some guests, that's a sort of utopian vision of where we might be able to get to. For others, it's a bit more of a dystopian worry about where we might be heading. Other people like to talk about sort of more pragmatic changes and programs of things that we can do to try and make a better world. And it would be fascinating to understand how you think the role of content and writing, but also marketing and messaging, can play into this story as well. Because I get this sense from all of the conversations I've had that most of the problems we're facing come down really to human psychology and social norms. Technically, they're quite easy to fix, and sometimes the philosophy is pretty obvious. Things like working to end animal agriculture is just such an obvious win-win-win for humans, for non-human animals, for the environment. The answer is, in a sense, quite easy. It's just a practical matter of working through the transition. But it seems to be these deeply entrenched social norms that are blocking us. So that's partly why I'm fascinated by the ideas of messaging and marketing, and how content can nudge us humans in better directions. So I should turn that into a question. But how do you think we can make a better future?
I think you've said it there. It's the consideration of all sentient beings and the environment. If you don't believe that's sentient, and a vegan lifestyle, on a personal level can get us closer to that, or as close as, vegan as you can get. I do believe in personal impact. I think we all have our little circles of influence, and that's how we create a bigger ripple effect. I think paying attention to just basic human rights, clean water access, even in the West here in North America, there are certain communities that still don't have clean water access, and I think we just got to get people on that baseline, receiving human rights, education, healthcare, including mental health, because a lot of the problems, here in Vancouver, we have one of the worst postal codes in North America for unhoused people and addiction. So that mental health care can really we have safe injection sites, which is a great Band-Aid solution, but that's not solving or preventing people from becoming addicted in the first place. So I believe mental health has a real part to play there.
But I think that's one of the interesting things about the sort of sentientist way of thinking, because in a way it picks up all of the sort of broadly compassionate humanistic ethics we might have about trying to help people have happier, more flourishing lives and mitigating human suffering. And it just says we need to do all of that good stuff, and people can debate over what the best approaches are, but it just extends that out, say, and we need to consider, non-human sentient beings in the same light as we think about farming and wild animals and so on as well. So it sort of just layers on an extra challenge for us, really. And quite often doing so actually helps us with many of the human challenges too. There's double reasons to do these things. So your most recent book is focused on this idea of marketing and messaging, particularly for vegan businesses. And that's one of the things I'd really love to get your insights on, because when we're dealing with a topic that is powerfully and deeply ethical at its core, when I look at what animal agriculture does, I think it's an egregious ethical horror. There seems to sometimes be this challenge of strategy around messaging, because on the one hand, there's, when I get snarky on Twitter and I'm the classic preachy righteous vegan, where you're using that ethical drive and you're challenging people's consistency and you're pointing out the incoherence of their arguments, and you're pointing out that being anti-vegan is pro-animal suffering, and and it feels good to do that, right? And there is an ethical clarity there, and the reason you're righteous is because you are actually right. So there's that sort of ethical drive, but there's also the recognition that while that might work with some people, it doesn't work with many of them, and quite often puts them off and puts them into a sort of polarized group-based way of thinking that makes them just reject it and kick it out. So then there's this other alternative, which is much more focused on, let's be effective, let's help people find a way that is less threatening, let's give people options, let's help people find their way on a journey. But sometimes those seem like two different alternatives, because the ethical approach feels good but seems ineffective, and the effective approach might be more effective but feels like you've lost some ethical clarity. And you're, are we really fighting for this in the way we should? So how do you think about that challenge in a marketing and messaging context? How do you advise people who are working on both causes but also promoting businesses that are trying to do good in the world to navigate that?
Yeah, I think you've pointed out really succinctly. The ethical argument is definitely important, and there's definitely a place for it. That's how it got me into this lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, you have to think about where people are at, and if people are not at the point where they're ready to give up meat, then it's the argument of, well, try this Beyond Burger instead, right? It tastes the exact same way. It's just made of plants, and I think that's what the role of marketing is. I know that there is there's the bad side to marketing and media where you are deceiving. There's certainly that. But one of the reasons why I wrote this book is because a marketing book specifically for the vegan industry does not exist. And so I thought there was a huge opportunity to speak, number one, specifically to the folks in this industry and who are trying to grow their own vegan businesses, because I think business is a huge part of how we have a better future. We need to have these alternatives if people are going to give up meat and seafood. But it's also for the average, I specifically did not want to put in why go vegan in this book. It's definitely a practical marketing book, business book, because if your everyday person just happens to find it somewhere and looks at it and thinks, wow, there are these types of businesses that don't even, they don't have animals in their business, and here are all the things that they can do for us, that will hopefully have affect that other side. And I think
I love that way of doing it. It's almost like an assumption that this is completely normal, and eventually the whole world will be, so why not get on board, right?
It's normalizing.
I'm not even going to try and persuade you because it's so obvious. Of course we'd have vegan business marketing books.
Yeah. And so I guess my short answer is there's room for all of that messaging, and it's to each business to find out for itself what is going to resonate most powerfully with its audience at the time. Because some folks may have a bigger vegan audience. Others are speaking completely to omnivores. And so I think you have to figure out what that line is for you in terms of how much you're going to talk about ethics in your messaging.
Yeah, thank you. And what would you say to someone who's skeptical of marketing, I guess the consumer economy, even capitalism? So, because there are many people who say, look, capitalism has exploitation built into the heart of it, and we can't fix these ethical problems in that system. And often marketing is co-opted to sort of ethics wash and greenwash rather than to, just inform people about good products. How do you respond to that sort of cynicism about the consumer route to positive change?
I mean, I agree. I absolutely agree with that. But going back to what we talked about earlier with, persuasion of your personal belief system, I mean, you've got to put on that critical thinking cap. If a major brand is putting a green logo, is that an actual certification? Because there are no regulations for, even if you put vegan on a product, that doesn't mean it's vegan. They're just making a claim, a marketing claim, and you have to, look at the ingredient list, even go so as far as to ask the company, because for some people it's life or death. Some people have very serious allergies, and if they don't know a certain ingredient is in the product, they could die. So it's really on the consumer to be smart about that. And I know we're coming up against huge juggernauts with money, and who can make those claims and will never face legal repercussions for that. But again, that's where our personal impact comes in, and you just have to be that discerning consumer to know right from wrong.
Yeah, thank you. And there are enormous pressures on people who are doing marketing, of course, commercial pressures and so on. Do you think it is possible to do marketing with integrity despite those pressures and challenges?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
In my previous business, when I ran my PR agency, in sort of the latter half of that time, I really wanted to focus on working with clients who were socially and environmentally responsible. And so I certified as a B Corp. I ran in that circle, 1% for the planet. And I was, trying to network and definitely attend events with these folks in mind. And so I know, that, there are great folks running businesses, look at Patagonia, that do believe in and are actually creating this positive impact. I think that a lot of them could stand to learn a little bit about veganism and about animal impact, because there are some great companies. I mean, Patagonia is an example. They're still using wool and certain animal products in their apparel line. So I think that conversation could be talked about more in those circles. But yes, there certainly is this community of businesses that I think are trying to move more in that direction.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I understand some of the skepticism and the cynicism about, I guess, capitalist modes of organization and corporations and so on. And you can see much of the damage that's been done, and much of the sort of broken marketing that some of these companies put out too. So I can see that. And there's also this school of thought that's been around for a long while in thinking about companies and capitalism, that ultimately companies shouldn't necessarily be ethical. They should just think about profits and the bottom line. That's their role. And, it's then consumers and governments who sort of plug the ethics in. And I've never really understood that way of thinking, because to my mind, a company is just another way for, human beings to collaborate to do some stuff. And those human beings have values and ethics. So why... of course, a company might, reflect the ethics of its customers because it wants to sell money, wants to sell products and services. But why can't that company itself have its own values? Because the human beings that run it and staff it and govern it and are even on its board and are its shareholders, they have values too, right? So why shouldn't they be reflected through this corporate mode of cooperation and organization? And I think it's a difficult journey, but you're seeing more and more companies play that through. And a cynic would say, that's just another clever marketing message because they want to look a certain way. But I think there's some genuine stuff going on as well. And you can see, employees and shareholders and managers and leaders of organizations actually implementing their ethics into their professional lives as well as their own personal lives. So.
Yeah, and I think it's due in part to this new generation that's growing up. They say it's millennial generation. I'm a millennial, and I don't know. I see a lot of claims about out there about what they're saying about us, but I do think, yeah, as you've said, that values are starting to play a bigger part in terms of how we work, because it makes sense. We're spending a good majority of our week working for somebody else. So, so we need to be considered. And so simple things like putting a salary range on a job description, or saying, we're open to all types of genders, and, how accessible they are. And, even just the transparency around job descriptions today, I think is improving. Whereas, it was definitely not that way.
We don't just have values, and we don't just have values on the weekends, right? So yeah. Cool. Well, that's been an absolutely fascinating journey through your personal philosophical story and your thoughts about how to make a better future too. Is there anything else you'd like to add into the conversation before we wrap up? And also, how can people find you, buy your book, learn more about your thinking and your work?
No, I just want to thank you for having this podcast. It's been a fascinating conversation. One of the most engaged I've ever had, that's for sure. And I think you have just a huge impact, and thank you for the work that you're doing. People can find me just with my name, sandranamoto.com is my website. Same thing on social media. And more information on my book you can find on my website as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And it's Vegan Marketing Success Stories is the title.
That's right.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you again. It's been a genuine pleasure talking to you. Please do stay in touch, and thank you for being a guest on Sentientist Conversations.
Will do. You're welcome.
Take care, Sandra.